So I wanted to talk quickly about this, I think his name is Rathbone. I don't really know much about him besides all of the terrible takes that were just flooding into my timeline today as people discovered this guy's really bad TikToks on the war in Ukraine. He's a working class musician slash teacher. And we all know that music teachers are the highest form of human development, so he's got a lot to say. Anyway, he released the TikTok that got a bunch of people's attention, and it was this one, and then everybody started looking all over the rest of his TikToks, and we've pulled a few of his other TikToks up so we can see the real ideological undercurrent of this warrior against aid to Ukraine. So this first one is simple. It's called the Ukrainian meat grinder, and this is the only one that actually got a context added. But considering that there's not really much, if anything, said in this video, it's kind of funny that it got a context added. I think it's the first time I've seen a non-verbal video have context added as a feature. Honestly, it's an achievement. So there you have the United States. Oh, there's Ukrainians represented as coffee beans being put in the grinder, which is known as Russia. It's interesting that the Ukrainians had to go into Russia to be grinded up, even though it was the Russians that invaded Ukraine. But who am I to speak? I'm not a coffee bean. Now Boris Johnson is put on top. I assume this is due to the theory that Boris Johnson has scuttled peace negotiations, which, I mean, has been openly known to be a crock of shit for a long time. I think Our Enemies Will Vanish is the book that probably most clearly deconstructed this, and the author of that book, who writes for, it's not the Washington Post, I believe it's the New York Times. I believe he's their chief foreign correspondent. He also wrote an article breaking this down as well. You can go check that out yourself. But the theory that Boris Johnson did this, I think, disregards exactly why the Ukrainians disagreed with the Istanbul framework and the disarming of Ukraine as a state after they've been invaded twice by the Russians within a under 10-year time period. The Istanbul framework was not going to work if the Russians were not willing to budge on Ukrainian demilitarization. And that was the big sticking point. Boris Johnson, from all reports, seems to indicate that he was not a huge fan of negotiating with the Russians, but the idea that he made the Ukrainians defend themselves is not only unproven, but I think there's a substantial amount of evidence against it. And it's also kind of insulting to the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people who ultimately made the decision to defend their country. The Ukrainians could have just not picked up guns and joined militias across the whole country to hold back the Russians. But they decided to do the opposite. It wasn't Boris Johnson who put a rifle in all their hands. Wow. You know, what I really love about this is the subtlety. It's the subtlety that I love about this. Structural adjustment program. The IMF. BlackRock. Honestly, this would be really good irony posting. This would be great irony. This rant coffee machine is the IMF. Strainer is BlackRock. You know what? The cup can be George Soros too. Why not? Oh, wow. Look, now it's capital. Okay. Not as fun as George Soros, but okay. Now it's a green face dollar emoji. Wow. Well, that was stupid. There wasn't really a point here outside of America made the Ukrainians fight the Russians and die in the meat grinder, and Boris Johnson did it. Boris Johnson thing is a lie. So that's one thing. The Russians invaded Ukraine. Usually it's not the country getting invaded that it's their fault, or it was the Russians that invaded. They invaded the country. But I don't want to get too into it. This genius art was already kind of dunked on by the added context feature. This video insinuates that the war was started by Ukraine in collaboration with the USA, While the opposite is true, Ukraine has been at war with Russia since 2014. The full-scale invasion started in 2022. It was fully orchestrated by Russia. And the two links to just Wikipedia. The reason I'm not going to get into too much detail is because there's more of these videos where he explains his context, and he likes to depict himself as the Chad Wojak, and you guys and the rest of us, we're the soy, uncritical thinker Wojak. Okay, so going into this, we've already lost the debate because we're the soy and he's the Chad, but we're still gonna sit here and listen to him, even though we've already been just completely blown out. Is this the one? No, this is not the one where he does the soy Wojaks. That's the next one. Let's start with the one where he doesn't go whole soy Wojak first. Let's start with this one first. This video is from 1 year ago. Sadly, it's still true. Ukraine is a rump state selling off its large assets to American firms like BlackRock to pay for its unwinnable war with Russia.
Ukraine has become a vassal for U.S. power, and the United States does not care about the Ukrainian people, believe it or not. All they care about is American business. That's why we have Secretary of State Antony Blinken admitting that the United States did not listen to Russian security concerns.
Let's read this. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Wednesday that he would not make the public the details of the written response, but he insisted that Washington State had not reserved its positions on Moscow's major request that NATO pull back its eastern presence, the Baltics and Eastern Europe, and the Ukraine, Georgia be part. Okay, that doesn't mean they didn't listen. I thought he meant they literally didn't listen. That just means that Russia's demand that NATO unilaterally, I mean, it's not even Antony Blinken's decision. It's not the United States' decision to just say, I'm sorry, NATO, but the alliance is gone, because NATO is a multi-state alliance, right? We can't just choose who goes in, goes out. But that NATO pull back its presence in the Baltics and Eastern Europe. So that means we'd be leaving Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, I would assume. Finland and Sweden, who tried to join, we would, of course, block them. And so now Russia, while it's invading Ukraine or getting ready to invade Ukraine, we'd be sending the signal, congratulations, your aggression was warranted. Now, if you invade them, we'll probably do nothing. We don't even have NATO in the region. Good luck. What message would that send to them besides, great, now we just wait a few years, invade down the line, or now, hey, we have even more countries to invade. After we invade Ukraine, we can also invade Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all countries that falls within Putin's ideological framework as being post-Soviet states, that therefore it's supposed to be within Russia's sphere of influence, which is the imperial viewpoint Vladimir Putin's government does take and openly admitted to taking at the start of the invasion. But we did listen to their concerns. It's just that their concerns was, hey, these countries would be really hard to invade right now. Could you please make it easier?
As late as January of 2022, when the war broke out, we have him and other.
And that also doesn't mean that we don't care about the Ukraine. The idea we didn't give the Russians what they wanted, therefore we don't care about the Ukrainians. I don't see that one-to-one line. Whatever.
Other U.S. officials admitting that they will fight to the last Ukrainian. They do not care about the Ukrainians.
They did not say we will fight to the last Ukrainian. This is amid massive casualties, Washington vows to fight to the last Ukrainian. This is somebody else's opinion piece. It literally says perspective on it. This is not a quote. This is an opinion piece.
They do not.
So I assume what they said is, it is Ukraine's decision to determine what losses are acceptable and not acceptable to the continuation of the war. I assume it's some statement along those lines, which is usually how these things go. It went for Finland that way. When it came to the Soviet invasion of Finland, we did not dictate to them, give up or not give up. Same thing was true about the Soviets when they were invaded by the Germans and took massive losses. China, when they were invaded by the Japanese and took unbelievable civilian casualties from not only just direct bloodshed and beheadings and murders from the Japanese army, but also massive flooding and natural disasters, all sorts of stuff. It was ultimately their decision to keep fighting. It was not the United States to go tell them, China, for your own good, say you got to learn Japanese. Okay, like it wasn't our place to do that. So again, this opinion piece, not a quote.
Care about the Ukrainians.
Again, another, it says commentary right there. And by the way, look, it's spelled the Russian way. I wonder why Kiev in this article spelled the Russian way. I don't know, it was just interesting.
They will fight to the last one. It doesn't matter. America's going to come out looking great from this. Ukraine will be decimated. We are offering up Ukraine to the Russians on a silver platter. And
What? We're offering up Ukraine to the Russians on the silver platter. The Russians invaded Ukraine. We didn't offer it up to them on a silver platter. We tried to give them weapons before the invasion was formally underway, once we had an idea of the invasion was happening. We didn't think the Ukrainians were going to be able to stand up. We thought what you think. Oh, it's unwinnable. Oh, the Ukrainians will just crush. And then the Russians invaded and they got curb stomped. And then we're like, oh, I guess actually maybe this war is winnable. And slowly, as we came to that realization, our policy changed when it came to different weapon shipments and gave them more capable weapons, because we thought, oh, it doesn't look like the country is going to just fall to Russian invasion. And our policy has continued from there since. But the idea that we gave it to them on a silver platter, I don't know, maybe in 2014 we did, when Obama decided to be pretty soft on the Russians in reaction to their invasion of Crimea. Maybe from 2014 to 2022 we did, as we continued to hold back on sending lethal munitions outside of some javelins in 2019. And even that got held up by President Trump. I don't know what he's talking about. Give Ukraine on the silver platter? It would be probably 2014 policy. But, I mean, what if the Russians invade? Would sending them weapons be not the opposite of giving them on a silver platter?
And Ukraine will be destroyed. And that is what people like Vaush are saying.
Is he complaining about Vaush? I think he's complaining about Vaush right now from a year ago.
That's what they're calling for. Think about who this benefits. American corporations...
I like that this is like we gotta like divert to just bash Vaush for a little bit. This video about the serious war. Okay, whatever.
Think about who this benefits. American corporations love that Ukraine is getting destroyed right now. Because now American capital can come move in. The IMF can come in now and offer structural adjustment programs to the Ukrainian government, basically putting them in debt to the IMF and Western capital in order to build up their country again. And guess who's going to profit from all this?
Let's do this with every aspect of it. China is the big winner. I think this is all China's plot. Why? Well, do you see the discounts the Chinese are buying Russian gas at? Do you see the deals they're making on the rivers and where they can construct property? Are you seeing where all their exports of drones are going to? Their drone industry is going kablamo on both the Russian side of the war, the Ukrainian side of the war. DJI has gone from a sports, fun, woohoo drone to something that people have PTSD nightmares about in over a 2-year time period. Oh, and that's not even to talk about. Look, I don't need to go into all the benefits. Point is, Chinese ain't doing too bad based off of this war. And so I can take that incentive, stretch it out and say, this is the real meaning of this. The real meaning is it's Xi's fault. It's the Chinese. Or in this instance, you're going to say it's BlackRock or these companies like or these companies, or it's the IMF, because Ukraine, being a country invaded by the largest one in the world, is in debt right now and is trying to get capital to keep their country afloat so they don't have mass graves in every major city and just maybe a quarter of them. So, like, I don't know who's going to profit from all this. And then you just say, oh, the Western companies. You know who else profits from this? The Russian defense companies. You know who else profits from this? Russian nationalists who believe that the Ukrainians are less than people. The Russian state propagandists who now have more work than... There's a million different people who have incentives and profit motives outside of Western companies. It's just that he is a Marxist. He's deep in Marxist dogma. He's deep in anti-American dogma. So this has to be the fault of the Americans, even though it's the Russians who invaded and their defense industry that is exploding the most.
American corporations. We've already seen this with BlackRock. Already, Larry Fink is meeting with Zelensky.
Oh my God. Guys, can you imagine a country getting invaded, having its electricity grid bombed? Half the day today, we didn't have power in Kiev. We didn't have power because the electricity grid is bombed. I wonder why the Ukrainians would want investment after the war to help repair. What do you think Zelensky should do? Oh, okay, you guys want to offer money? Well, we are a Juche system. We only base from the domestically made. Our currency is Kherson watermelons. Okay, no, they can't do that. They have to get investment from somewhere, and the Russians aren't going to give them money. And also, were we under the assumption that the Russians, if they got their way, would not be buying out Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian resources? Before 2014, how much of Ukraine's resources in resource industry were controlled by Russian oligarchs? That ever talked about? Let me tell you, it was a high percentage. Like, why is it we're just concentrating on the American companies like BlackRock? Yes, there are companies who will profit from war. Guess what? There were companies that profited from war during World War II. Does that mean that there weren't other incentives that were completely valid from the United States perspective and from the United Kingdom's perspective and from France's perspective for fighting that war, irrespective of what the defense companies would gain? This is the problem with this dogma of viewing wars. It's you go into every war, just say, what companies profit? Oh, American company profit? I guess we have to abandon them to mass graves. It's surrendering yourself to dogma, including your critical thinking, which that's going to be funny in a second here.
They're getting this all set up. Ukraine will become, if it isn't already now, a plantation for American corporations and American capital accumulation.
A plantation. The Ukrainians are slaves. They're going to be singing slave songs to BlackRock, their slave master on the plantation. And then one day we'll have Ukrainian Abraham Lincoln, who will come and free all the Ukraine slaves from the evil slave master, I guess, Rostislav Davis, the leader of the Ukrainian Confederate. What is this nonsense? Okay, moving on to the soy jack nonsense. So another thing this guy does, which I find very entertaining, this is my best part about this guy personally, I love this part, is that when he does these like fake debates where he sets up his own position and then he sets up the like enemy position. And then he's there and he's saying all the smart stuff. He's articulate. And the other guy is just doing ad hominems and just yelling insults. And he's flustered. And then he labels himself the critical thinker. And then he labels the other guy the uncritical thinker. And wouldn't you know it, whoever holds his position and believes what he believes is the critical thinker. And whoever supports Ukraine is the uncritical thinker. So, I mean, we're blown out from the start. We're just by default uncritical thinker. We start the game, we have 0 health. Like we can't do anything here. We've already lost because he depicted himself as the Chad, and we're the gay soy. What are we gonna do? Well, we're gonna watch it anyway.
Putin is a psychopath. I don't believe Putin is a psychopath. Well, you're a Putin shill, a Kremlin propagandist, a Russian apologist. Understanding that NATO provoked and escalated a geopolitical situation which ultimately led to war in Ukraine, being used as a proxy between the United States and Russia, is not a justification for what is an illegal invasion and a war crime committed by the Russian government against Ukraine. Both of these things can be true. No, you're just defending Russia. You're apologizing for Putin when you say that NATO escalation led to war.
I mean, he is.
Brother, even the head of NATO himself, Jens Stoltenberg, admitted publicly that NATO escalation led to the war in Ukraine, as have an innumerable amount of U.S. officials over the past 3 decades.
Okay, can I just go out there this quickly? Number one, when is it now that U.S. official says something, yay, it's true because this affirms what I believe, but if I was to be like, okay, here's all the U.S. officials who are saying that's not the case, you'd be like, no, those U.S. officials are wrong. Because the problem I have with this framework, and I can say about this, if it contributed anything, it contributed, I would say, the smallest amount out of all the possible reasons. I can't completely say that NATO expansion didn't have any impact. It certainly allows them to go, ooh, scary. 11% of our territory is bordered by NATO states. Ooh, terrifying. They can say that for sure. Now, most of those countries, definitely the ones bordering them, joined them because of the fear of Russia invading them. You ask the Bulgarians, they said this very openly in the early 2000s when they joined NATO. We're joining NATO because right now the Russians are not hot shit, but when they become hot shit again, they're coming. And so we're not going to be alone. Let us join NATO. It wasn't just the Bulgarians that had that sentiment, by the way, and looked out that they were right. But if it's true that it was NATO expansion that provoked this, then my question would be, in 2014, when the Russians first invaded Ukraine and this whole war started in the first place, how much closer was Ukraine to joining NATO than they were the 6 years prior? Or let's say 2022. How much closer was Ukraine to joining NATO than it was, say, in 2014? It was no closer. They gave a statement that they wanted to join in 2008 with the Georgians. They both said, yeah, we both kind of want to join. NATO said, we in principle like that idea. But a ton of NATO members did not agree to it. The Germans didn't. The French didn't. The Hungarians under Viktor Orban, you think they were going to approve it? Turkey didn't approve it. There were so many different countries that were not on board with it, in large part because of how reliant they were on Russian natural gas exports. So they didn't want to piss off the Russians. And they didn't want to escalate the conflict. And so that is conflict between the West and Russia and the negative tensions that were building at the time. And so Ukraine didn't join in 2008. They didn't join in 2014, and they didn't join in 2022. The big thing that happened in 2014 was the EU association agreement, with Yanukovych promised to join, fell back on his promise after the Russians lied about using economic coercion against Ukrainians, used it after they promised not to in the 1990s in the Budapest Memorandum, and then when everything went to shit and the government killed over 100 people and Yanukovych fled the country, they invaded Crimea, even though the new government said, Yatsenyuk was like, look, we will negotiate a continuation of the Russian lease in Crimea. But that was not enough. They wanted to take advantage of the chaos and intervene and illegally invade and annex Crimea. Now, NATO had nothing to do with that. NATO was no closer to joining and taking over that area 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. No closer whatsoever. Ukraine was upping up its military standards. Ukraine was trying to align its military standards to be more NATO-centered, to be, higher up in its military quality. But that's also because at the start of the war in 2014, they had like maybe 10,000 effective troops. The majority of the people that were holding back the Russians were like volunteers from the civilian population that picked up rifles and didn't want to see their country invaded. But this was the dynamics that launched the whole war off in the first place. And they were no closer to joining NATO in 2014 than they were in 2022. So if someone tells me it's NATO expansion, then I would say, like, how did NATO expand in those in-between years? How was NATO expanded since? Because if the war was provoked by NATO expansion, then this has been a disaster, because all it did was make NATO expand faster into countries like Finland and Sweden. I just don't buy NATO expansion as the main justification for this war. It would be a tiny side justification, if anything.
You're justifying the Russian invasion. Being anti-NATO isn't being pro-Russia.
I mean, in the case of some countries, it would be. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. If we were to listen to the demands he said we should have, like, his big plan for avoiding this war, from what he put forward, is, just make NATO smaller, and then the Russians will play nice. It's naive, it's childish, and it assumes good faith on a country that's given none of it towards us. So, yeah, no, I think it's, honestly, I think he would end up provoking more wars than he's trying to stop.
Escalating a physical conflict between two nuclear world powers spells disaster for the entire world. The point is, the invasion is a war crime and should be rightly condemned, and yet also there were reasons which were predicted leading to the war itself. Those are two objective facts about the crisis in Ukraine.
Well, their interpretation, the second one is an interpretation, whatever. Continuing, we've got more Soy Jack versus Chad debates to look at here. Damn, Ukraine is a neoliberal rump state. You guys know why Ukrainians don't like this guy? Can you guys put a finger on it? I can't seem to put a finger on it. Ukraine should have the right to join any alliance that it wants. Really? Wow, that's crazy. What? They should be allowed to join any alliance? That's bizarre. Of course. So then naturally you believe that every country has a right to join whatever military alliance they wish. Yeah. So then by that logic, you would be completely okay with, let's say, Puerto Rico, Cuba, or Mexico forming a military alliance with Russia. They've done that for decades. It was like Cuba and Russia has had a military alliance. The Soviet Union had a military alliance with Cuba. And guess what we had to do? We had to suck it up and deal with it. They put nuclear weapons there. We had a crisis. You want to know how that crisis ended? It ended by them removing the nuclear weapons, Cuba staying an independent communist state, hostile to the United States, still allied with the Soviet Union, Soviet troops still stationed there, still working with them, still giving them military resources, and it lasted that way for the entirety of the Cold War after the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The difference is the Russians didn't use exiles and members of the diaspora to invade Ukraine, even though they did a little bit of that in 2014. They just invaded Ukraine, failed, and then didn't learn from their Bay of Pigs and just kept going and kept going and kept going. The real comparison here would be if Ukraine joined NATO or is about to join NATO and we just moved nukes into Ukraine so we could get a quicker travel time to Moscow. But in 2022, just like in 2014, Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO, and we certainly weren't talking about putting nuclear weapons in Ukraine. In fact, we were the country that made Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons to the Russians, and then the Russians took the missiles from the nuclear weapons and then bombed Ukraine with it. After they committed, say, look, you just gave up your nukes. We would never invade you after you gave up these ultimate guarantors of state sovereignty. And now we've rewarded the Ukrainians for contributing to the international goal of nuclear non-proliferation by making sure that those weapons don't end up in the hands of terrorists, by making them give them to the country that would terrorize them. And then we do nothing to help. Pretty sad.
Or Canada forming an alliance with China. China? Yeah, but China and Russia are enemies. By your logic, that does not matter, and that should not be perceived as a threat to the United States. Every country, as you say, has a right to join whatever military alliances they choose. Well, yeah, I guess so. Let's follow this logic through. Don't back down from your claim. By your rationale, it is okay for Russians to install nuclear weapons in Cuba, or for China to...
Wait, I'm sorry. This extension of the logic makes no sense. You're fine with any country joining any alliance they like, then you must also be okay with one country who just joined a military alliance of your enemy putting nuclear weapons in their capital that are aimed at your What? No, that doesn't make any sense. You don't need to extend that logic. One person could be perfectly fine with the expansion of a defensive alliance in the face of the aggression of an expansionist state without wanting to expand nuclear proliferation. These two things are completely separate issues. You could try to tie them together, but the idea that one person believing in the expansion of a defensive military alliance automatically equates them wanting nuclear weapons in those countries. No, that's silly.
To conduct military intel operations on the Canadian border, or for, let's say, the Russian...
Can you invite this guy on stream? I would talk to this guy on stream in a heartbeat. No problem.
Army to train 100,000 Mexican troops.
By the way, what's crazy about like half of these things he's saying is the stuff that actually did happen during the Cold War. Like half the stuff he's saying here that's crazy, would you ever be okay with it, is stuff that just happened.
Essentially baking it into the Russian chain of command. Or for China to send a fleet of nuclear subs to a country like Peru so they can patrol the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. This is all okay. Well, wait, I didn't say all of that. Obviously, this is what that means. Ask yourself, how might the US react if any of those geopolitical situations that I just outlined became a material reality?
I mean, we could talk about Cuba. That happened. We had a crisis, and the solution was no nukes in Cuba, but we're not going to do a regime change and invade them. Okay, I'm fine with that deal with Ukraine. No nukes in Ukraine. Russians leave Ukraine. That's a deal that anyone in the world would make. The Ukrainians would be the first one to make it. In fact, the Ukrainians made that deal in the 90s. And guess what they got for taking that deal? Invaded.
If you are not a hypocrite and are actually consistent with your logic, then you believe that the United States has absolutely no right whatsoever to interpret these geopolitical events as existential threats to their territorial sovereignty. Look, I get what you're saying, but this is a whataboutism. NATO was not a threat to Russia. Yeah, and neither was the nuclear weapons Russia placed in Cuba in 1962. All of these examples that I just gave is exactly what the United States is doing in Eastern Europe with NATO. Again, with the whataboutism, the United States did...
So let me just, to get this clear, if we're going to be solid about this guy's belief is that the Russians should not have allied with the Cubans and just allowed us to barrel in there, curb stomp them until the communism is gone, and put Batista to Electric Boogaloo in power so we can start looting from the general population again. That's his, he would just be like, well, what are the Russians going to do? It's in America's backyard. What, are they going to send them weapons? Ooh, that would be provocative.
Not have nuclear weapons aimed anywhere near Russia.
Anyway, it's poor critical thinker dealing with dumb Ukraine supporters. One last video. Okay, this one's my favorite. I have no commentary for this. I think I'm just gonna play this video.
Where will you go now that
Wow. Russia punched America with the Ukraine. What's great about this is that he said in his video that we're going to be fine no matter how the war in Ukraine goes, but somehow in the edits, even though the Russians have lost 350,000 troops and we've lost none, we're getting beat up. America's getting beat up by the Russians in Ukraine. Again, we've lost nothing. The Russians have lost a generation of men that will demographically cripple them. But we're the real victims. Us Americans. Not the Ukrainians. They're not the victims here. The real victims are either us or the Russians. The Iranians beat us up in... What is that supposed to be? Is that Yemen? It doesn't have like all the symbols on. Okay, I think that's supposed to be Yemen, yeah. You should be... Wow. Who's this? China? I guess they didn't have any Chinese people for settled with their white TikToker. Wow, look at all... This is really... Turn off the music. So is this like all aesthetic? Is this just all about like fun, like TikTok edits? I don't know what he thinks Brics is, but if you look at these countries, like the two countries at the top, Russia and China, beat each other to death with sticks on the border. That's not a joke. Look it up. Chinese, Indian soldiers, sticks. And you can find any number of compilation of them going like John Cena on each other with whatever branches they can find. I mean, India and China. If you look at Brazil here, actually, Brazil has its own number of, I don't get a point is a lot of these countries do not have such cohesive military or strategic policy that click together. In fact, many of them have disagreements. The only thing they generally agree about is the idea that there should be some balance in comparison to American power on the world stage, possibly in the economic front. But the big problem with Brics right now is they can't really propose any competing currency. They failed to up to this point. The closest that has been proposed, I think the Russians proposed the ruble. They proposed the ruble, the currency that's been free fall, then stopping free fall again, stopping free fall. $1 means 100 rubles, and now it's back to 90. In the midst of an economic crisis, yeah, not going to be the option. Other option is the Chinese currency. Chinese manipulate their currency like crazy for political reasons, so it's not really a good internationally backed currency. Maybe, I mean, what, the Indian rupee? Where they just make a new currency? The Chinese don't even think there should be a competition with the dollar for currency with a single competitor. They think that nation states should just be trading their own local currencies. Point is, Brics as a concept could be, with more coordination, could be a lot more of a challenge to U.S. power. But it only challenges U.S. power in certain ways, and it hasn't been particularly coordinated in challenging in the ways that they have up to this point. It's more at this point an expression of desire, of dissatisfaction with the status quo of international affairs. Anything else, which is how this video is being portrayed anyway. It's not like, hey, here's the economic deal that Brics just made to destroy America, because it doesn't exist. Oh, here's the thing that's no, it doesn't exist. So it's mostly aesthetics. Like the Brics investment bank is it's like 50 to 60% Chinese money. Mostly like a Chinese initiative. I don't know if the Russians put any money into it. Why is this woman in the video? What is she in here for? She's just standing there and like twirling her hair. Actually, this is a perfect representation of what Brics is doing. This woman right here. Can I just say, if I ever do TikToks like this in favor of Ukraine, the first person to see me can grab me and throw me into oncoming traffic. Because I wouldn't want to. Good. So I'm sorry. What is the? It's just LARPing about just like LARPing geopolitics. Like like the country balls were already bad enough. Can we go back to the country balls instead? I'd rather do that, okay, than whatever this was, okay? I don't know if this was an attempt to do a first edit on China. I don't know why China is this white woman, but all hail comrade China white woman big boob. I don't know what, like, why the thirst? I the first edit.